I would probably change a little bit of that now, having gained a little more knowledge of the city government, having gained a little more knowledge of the different programs that are out there and different things. So it's important to always stay involved and to keep an open mind, to be able to have flexibility in changing your mind as you learn more things. So that was kind of an angry speech, if you will, or kind of an angry comment that I made up there at the time. At the time, I was not planning on running for office, but shortly after I decided, yep, I probably should do that just to get some of my thoughts out there and to see, if we can change some things. And we all know how that ended. But so that was that. And then, fast forward a few years, I stayed involved and I stayed around, and I may have spoke a few more times or talked to different council members. And then the election happened, and then, Team Huber came into office. But even after all that, and after me speaking out there and starting the Brick City Town Hall page and speaking out against government, I was still appointed to the Charter Review Commission, which is, to me, a very important commission. So when I hear folks, now I can understand where some folks come from, when they talk about having someone retaliate against them for speaking out on political issues. But when I was appointed to that commission by the council, some of which I spoke out against, as you just heard, it's hard for me there are certain things that have happened since then that I question, was that a retaliation on certain issues, certain different things? But I'm okay with that. It's politics, and I get that. The moral of that story is don't be afraid to speak out if you have something. Don't be afraid to ask questions if you have them. Do that. Get involved. It's important because I think the government, and especially the elected officials, are forced to move in certain directions if the citizens come out and say, hey, we don't like this. Don't do that. Please don't do that. We elected you to do this. Stay focused and move in that direction. Whatever you feel on city government, whether you agree with me or you don't agree with me, speak out and get involved. So my wife had ended up getting a job at Randolph Air Force Base, San Antonio, Texas. So while I was on the Charter Review Commission, I found out she was getting that job, and we talked about it, and everything was something, we worked it out, and we had to move to Texas. And at this time, I had been a Huber resident for basically my entire life. I was born and raised in the city of Huber Heights. And there were different periods of time where I'd move out for a year and I'd always come back. Move out for a year, always came back. And I knew when we moved out to Texas that we were coming back. I knew that. It was a position with the Air Force that she was taking. And we had talked about, okay, we'll move out there, but then, we'll come back because this is where family was. And I got out there and I still paid attention to what happened in Huber Heights. Thankfully, the city has hhoh.org and the videos that they post, and I paid attention. And I enjoyed doing podcasts, and I had been thinking about doing one for a while. And I was paying attention. But I started a podcast called Inspired and Admired. Some of you may have listened to that one. And the premise of that was to talk with interesting people and hear different stories and tell different stories about other interesting people that may have been throughout history. I went up to Dealey Plaza and did a podcast on JFK. I talked about a guy named William Morgan, who was an American who fought with Castro during the Cuban Revolution. And I talked to folks. The first podcast I ever did with Inspired Admired, I talked to a prison guard who happens to be one of my friends. He's a former prison guard now, but he was a prison guard at the time. I'm very interested in prison reform and justice reform and things like that. creating laws that are fair for all citizens, not just some, right? I talked to the Keegan Miller, who ran the Miami Valley Young Marines, to shine a light on them, and because it's a great program. My young son's in it now. All this stuff. But then, by like the third episode of Inspired and Admired, I talked to, and this was 2017, I talked to Richard Shaw, because I was paying attention, and I had him on the podcast, and then I started having different folks from the election that was coming up that was in 2016. So I reached out to all those folks and said, hey, let's do the podcast. And then it just bled in to what we have now, Truman's Town Hall, the podcast. And we are at 50 episodes from the beginning till now. And that's the history and how we got to 50 episodes. And what I would like to maybe incorporate some of what I used to do with Inspired and Admired, and maybe look for folks around the community who are interesting, who do have a story to tell, and maybe add that into this, as well as paying attention to what city government does, because I do still believe that that's important. But I do believe there are other great stories out there from our citizens. We have a very diverse community here in Huber Heights, one that I'm very proud of. When folks say, Matt, where are you from? Huber Heights. That's where I'm from. I met someone in Texas. I was wearing, I don't know if it was a Dayton Dragon shirt or something, but I was taking the trash out, and the lady was walking up, and she goes, oh, you're from Dayton. I'm like, no, ma'am, I'm from Huber Heights. I go out and watch the Dragons. And she's like, oh, I know where Huber is. I used to live in, I think it was Centerville. It's like, oh, wow, small world, you know? And you can connect a lot of things. We have a lot of folks from Huber Heights that have done great things. I'm proud of our veterans from Huber Heights. There's a lot of veterans. I wish I would have been able to get, I wish I would have done a podcast with one of our great veterans who probably would be on the Military and Veterans Commission today, Jack Brankamp. I wish I would have done a podcast with him. So that's one of the things that I'm thinking. Maybe we do some podcasts, or somebody else creates this podcast. So if you hear this and you want to do a podcast about different interesting people around Huber Heights, take that idea and run with it. It's yours. But I think this type of thing, this podcast, the new media that we have, blogs, Facebook, things like that, there can be bad things to it. I understand. But we can use it for good and try to enact change and try to persuade our elected officials to do certain things that we would like them to do. And I think it can be used for good. And I hope that I maintain that and I continue to use it for good. And I know folks don't agree with my political opinions all the time. And I can accept that. And if you don't, I'd love to discuss it. truepodcast@gmail.com. Hit me up on an email. Maybe we could, if folks were more involved. I know there are a lot more folks listening to this podcast now, but if folks are more involved and they want to send emails, I'll read them on here, especially if folks disagree with what I say. Because for me, I know there's folks that I don't care what anybody says. Well, I do, actually. Am I going to, take it and make it God? No, but I'm going to read it. Okay, well, maybe I could do this better. Maybe I could do that better. And honestly, I think we all care about what folks think about us. Integrity is a very important part of me. I could go into that, but I'm not. This podcast is, we're going on an hour. So you heard about the work session. It's the 50th episode of Truman's Town Hall. We went through the history of it. And if you made it this far, thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading. I look forward to continuing to do Truman's Town Hall. I think I've proven that regardless of where I'm at in the world or the country, that I care about the city of Huber Heights. I may not care about it in the same way you do, but I do care about it. And I do appreciate others who do care about it. And I know I played that clip of, going for the lack of a better word, going off on city council, but I knew all those folks cared about it, or they wouldn't sit up there. They care about it maybe in a different way than I do, and that's okay. Differences of opinion are okay. It frustrates me when I see folks on Facebook or wherever fighting with each other, going personal, calling names and getting that frustrated. Why? Why do we go there? Why can't we just have a discussion and then move on from it? What is so hard about that? I've never understood, one thing I do that might put this more in perspective is I try anyway to separate my entertainment and politics. I know there are a lot of entertainers out there who get involved. But for that, I don't always agree with Bill Maher, but I went down to Cincinnati to see him because I think I think he has interesting things to say. Not that I probably don't agree on 90% of what he says, but he's a comedian. I like him comedy. And I like his political comedy. I may not agree with it, but it's like, ooh, wow, that was harsh. Sean Penn movies. I know he was big during the Iraq War, going to Iraq and visiting, and I still watch Sean Penn movies. I probably don't agree with him on much. Anyway, I think we need to, having done 50 episodes of Truman's Town Hall, I think we all need to take a step back. Maybe put ourselves in someone else's shoes and maybe look at what they are talking about and try to understand where they're coming from. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but try to understand where they're coming from. And force our folks who are going for political positions or who are holding a political position to be a little more fair to each other. To understand that, we're all working for the city and we all have to understand that there are a lot of folks that live here who all have different opinions, and we have to do what is best for the city. We don't, the day of driving a personal agenda needs to be done. I'm not sure how we get there, but, by speaking out on certain things, maybe we can direct that a little more. And that's it, folks. That's it. 50 episodes of Truman's Town Hall. Thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading. I'll see you at 51.
Thank you for listening to Truman's Town Hall. Share this podcast with your friends and neighbors and subscribe today.